Are giants in the earth now? And why does it matter? I propose they do exist now. Just not in the form or image that is normally associated with the term giant, as we generally understand it today. Using the King James Bible, we'll try to wrap our head around this, a little Bible study here, and see what we can realistically deduce without going outside of the King James Bible to Enoch or the book of the giants or the Jubilees or any of that other crazy extra biblical I can't speak, extra biblical nonsense. It's nonsense. There's a reason why it's not in the King James Bible. If you've ever poked around in it and have any kind of discernment at all, you realize pretty quick it's a bunch of nonsense. So we're not going to do that here. We're going to look at what the King James Bible says. Okay? Now, this matters. Why does this matter? Why does this whole thing about giants matter? Well, it matters because we should look at Scripture as man's history, man's past, his present, why he is where he is, and why things are the way they are right now, and man's future. Even though it's hard to decipher, he still gives us enough to hope on, hope for, hope on, hang on to, you know. And we should do this when it's questions about our own world, when it's something strange, especially when it's something strange. Man, if you believe the Bible, if you genuinely believe it, we're supposed to be able to go to it and say, okay. You know, just as in a previous video that I did regarding UFOs and aliens, we should see what God says and frame our understanding based on what it does and does not say. Okay? So let's do that. Let's do that. So to start out, looking at the King James, okay? The word giant. There's 19 verses with the word giant. And the first mention is in Genesis 6:4, which is going to be our text for today. That's why I've got it up on the screen. The most famous giant, the one you've heard of as a kid since Vacation Bible School, Goliath, right? He's only mentioned 6 times. 6 times for being so famous, right? There is a race of giants that is mentioned quite a number of times in the Old Testament. They're called the Anakim, or the sons of Anak. And they're mentioned in 16 different verses. But one that surprised me as I was doing research for this study, and I don't do these things quickly. I take my time and pray about things. But I was surprised that there's this one guy, this one dude, you know, I've noticed his name, Og, king of Bashan, right? I've noticed his name several times reading the Psalms. And he's always mentioned as being this great victory that Israel had, right? Well, I didn't realize until I did this study or looked into it real closely that he's a famous giant that was a king. That's the reason why they mention him all the time. I mean, think about it. If your ancestors rose up and killed an actual giant to be able to possess the land, yeah, I'd probably write songs about that too, right? But anyway, I thought that was pretty interesting that there's a lot of verses that reference giants in some way, whether it's literal giants in the sense of the word giant, or named giants. I mean, there are giants named all through the Old Testament, and they're not just named; they are described where they were dispatched, the city or town they were dispatched in, and who did it, and what their name was. I mean, it's pretty detailed in the sense that there's a whole lot of different accounts of these giants being run out of the land and killed and run down and exterminated, right? So it's quite interesting that those words come up a lot. I mean, it's all through Deuteronomy and Joshua and Judges and Numbers, 1st and 2nd Samuel, Chronicles, giants by name, where they were taken care of, and by whom, and descriptions of them. Like there's a description of the size of his bed, and there's another one about how heavy his spear was, and to describe how big these men were. Now, they were usually, from the descriptions, the best description of the size of these giants comes to the description of Goliath, and if we take that as the literal description, it's describing him as being somewhere between 8 and 10 foot tall. So let's just say 9 foot, right? I think it's 6 cubits and a span. All right, so 6 cubits is 9 feet. A span is probably 6 inches. So 9.5 foot tall, probably something like that. Well, that's the usually they are referred to as being men that are bigger than taller than other men, and great warriors. And I mean, and think about it. If there were only a few hundred giants in the land, you know that they would be up for hire. You know they would. Just like Goliath, he was a mercenary. He wasn't a true Philistine. He was fighting for the Philistines. Okay? So, it's interesting to imagine that they were a lot more common than you would think. So, let's look at Genesis 6 right here that I have up on the screen, and let's see what it says, because this is the first mention of giants, and it tells us a lot. I mean, we're basing a lot of what we're understanding here on this passage of scripture, right? So, because all these other mentions come after, okay? They're all in the history of mankind. All these different conflicts and all these characters and all these giants that were being dispatched, right? So, but it all starts right here in Genesis. So let's see what it says. In Genesis 6:1 it says, "And it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them." All right, let's pause right there. In my research, this is right before the flood that it's describing, right? So in my research, this is what I found. So most this would have been in a biblical timeline. This would have been about 5,000 years ago. So about 3,000 BC, right before the flood, right? The population in the world, some people think it was just tens of millions. Some people think it was a couple billion. I kind of somewhere in the middle is hundreds of millions of people were in the world. So there was plenty of people in the world, right? So this in Genesis 6:1, it's saying, "And it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth." I would say that's multiplied a good while. That's a good many folks, right? It says, "And daughters were born unto them." Verse 2, "That the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. Okay, right here, this is a reference. When you see a reference in the Old Testament to the sons of God with the little s, sons of God, that is usually, 9 times out of 10, it is a reference to angels, angelic beings, right? That's the Old Testament term used for them. Many of the times when you see this word, that's what it is, most of the time. Okay? So, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men, that they were fair. The sons of God, the angels were looking at the good-looking women of human men down there, and going, man, they sure are some good-looking creatures. Okay? Says that saw that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. Took them wives. Now that sounds forceful, and for a long time before I started doing this study, I started thinking that it was a forceful type of thing, and it may be, because there's a lot of little questions that come up in this whole understanding right here, right? So don't know. We don't know. But the more I've studied on it, the more this could mean that they chose who they wanted because they had power over them. They took them. They had whoever they wanted, right? It could be that type of context, okay? So here in verse 3 it says, "And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. Now this is the same section here where God mentions that he sees just how evil man has become. So, and even though he says it before making that point, to me it almost sounds as if that is the reason why he shortened man's life, is because of man's wickedness. And after this point in man's history, the ages of man start decreasing. And that's significant in this study, that mankind's age starts decreasing after this whole incident right here. Verse 4 says, and this is the key verse, "There were giants in the earth in those days," meaning the days before the flood, "and also after that." So, the days before the flood and after the flood. So, it has been happening since the flood. That's what that is. That's what that is indicating. In the way that is worded, that is indicated. It says, in those days and also after that. And how is that happening? When the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, had them, so to speak, and they bear children to them, the same, meaning those same children, those children that were just mentioned right there, those same children became mighty men, which were of old, men of renown. Mighty, strong, fierce, terrible. That sounds like a giant. That sounds like a dude that's 9-10 foot tall, that's stronger than everybody else and able to whoop everybody else, and he's the gun for hire, right? Verse 5 says, "And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually." And see, you can see right there, that's the reason why I think that he shortened man's days, is right there in that same section, because he saw man's heart. And boy, don't that sound like today's world. Every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. I forget where that passage is, but it says, "Who can find a righteous man?" Yeah. Who can find a righteous man? You know, it's kind of neat. We can see there in this passage that the angels They had envy. They had lust. They had pride. They had defiance. Does that mean that angels have free will? I don't know. That's a good question. It almost seems like they must have if they chose to disobey God, if they chose to do something wrong. So that sounds like a free will issue. Interesting, isn't it? They found those human women so desirable that they couldn't help themselves. That's how beautiful a woman can be. The angels had power over them, though. That's what it sure sounds like. That's what it sure indicates. At least in the way that it sounds to me. And they took them wives of all which they chose. The ones that they chose, they didn't have to make do. So, that sounds to me like they had some kind of power over these women, right? And it indicates there in 6:4, it says, in those days and also after that. That means that before the flood and after. So, if we look at it from a historical aspect, that means that it's been continuing, because I don't see anything in that scripture right there that indicates that it ever stopped. And then God sees man's evil heart and shortens his lifespan. Yeah, he does. Around the time that this happened, people's lifespan was between 800 and 900 years old. And then it started getting shorter and shorter as time went on. By the time you got to Moses lived to be 120. Joshua, 110. David lived to be 70. Solomon lived to be 60. I'd say God shortened man's life, wouldn't you? The evil that we have carried within our own flesh throughout the history of mankind has done nothing but tear us down. So, let's recap that. Are giants in the earth now? I propose that they have existed in the past and don't see any indication that it has stopped happening. If we frame what we know within what God says, it does seem possible to me for a distorted, corrupted creature to still be in existence. Now, maybe not as a fearsome king or a mercenary for hire. Maybe more elusive and kept from view, maybe. Large bipedal scary things have been sighted all over the world and recorded in various ways over all man's history. That was interesting to me. It's everywhere. I was researching just how far across the globe there are stories and sightings of very similar things. And there's songs and stories and pictures and of course, there's sound and video and things like that too, right? And they're called many different names. They're called Bigfoot and Sasquatch and Yeti and Almas and Skunk Ape, Wendigo. Usually something between 8 and 10 foot tall, somewhere around there is most of the reports of what people have seen or experienced. They're usually large and elusive and mysterious, scary. And I've seen a few things. Now, I can't say that I've seen something like that, but I've seen a few things that I can't explain either. And I've known people that have, and they truly believe like they've seen something. Not sure what they've seen, but they're sure they've seen something. 20 to 25% of Americans think Bigfoot or Sasquatch might be real. Okay. Then enough people have seen something. Now they might not be able to explain it or might not know how to explain it, but that don't mean they haven't seen something. Just like me. As always, though, I do think that a percentage of the things that people see are wrong, of course. Man will always try to capitalize on something, follow whatever fad there is, get some kind of story going, get some kind of attention, right? So you're saying Bigfoot is a giant, Gary? Well, a version, a distorted remnant. Man's gene pool has only gotten worse. Think about them ages getting shorter, right? Satan has only worse and worse genetic stock to work with over time. It's just going to get worse. Each new distorted creation is worse off than the previous, more deformed, less intelligent, a flawed specimen. So you say, why would the giants be hidden from public? How, I've just been trying to think of, questions I would ask, right? So why would they be hidden from public? Well, they weren't always in the past, right? If you think about all these accounts that I've told you about that are in the Old Testament, man, there's probably close to 100 different verses, 100 different places in the Old Testament that talk about giants of some kind. So they weren't hidden in the past. But, even though in the past and even now, I think they're used, it's Satan trying to use them to distort things and try to corrupt something, corrupt a creation of some kind, I guess. But it's really God using these things to terrorize man, is really what it is. But still, even now, even though they're not as public or whatever, I think that God still uses these type of things, these type of strange, scary things, to terrorize mankind, just on a smaller scale. Just like dragons, they were hunted and killed off early in man's history. I guess Satan didn't realize that man could be brave enough to go up against them. But there's no indication that what was happening in Genesis 6 isn't still happening. And that's the weird thing. That's the thing that makes you go, okay, well, there's got to be an answer. And that's the reason why I lean towards something like this, because it's really, it seems to make sense, okay? And in 6:4 it says, in those days and also after that. Exactly. Once again, there's nothing saying that it ever stopped. So where would we see anything that people have seen in this world, all over this world, that fits the description of something that's 8 to 10 foot tall and big and strong and scary and dominating? It sure sounds like it, don't it? And so how does that happen? Well, right here in Genesis 6, it's saying somehow angels lust after women and take who they want and have children. And they end up being some type of distorted creation. Why God allows it, I don't know. But this indicates that it still happens. Not only do I think they existed in the past, but I think they hide amongst us, you know, within the wilderness and the dark places, destined to be used by God to terrorize man. 2 Corinthians 5:11 says that we need to know the terror of the Lord. The terror of the Lord. God has every right to terrorize man at his will. That's something that once you start studying the Word and really trying to understand how God looks at mankind, you realize that he has every right to do as he wishes with his own creation. Even if we understand it or not. Yeah, 2 Corinthians 5:11 says, know the terror of the Lord. Yeah. And God scares some people so they'll run to him. I was talking to my wife about this, and she said, think of a tornado or a hurricane. That's to drive people to God. And I said, exactly right, hon. That kind of terrorizing people to drive people to him. Jude 1:23 says that some people need to be afraid to be saved. Some people are drawn to God by love. Some people are drawn to God by fear. And I think that's the reason why God allows these scary things and these unknown things. And even stuff that might be an abomination. It might be some experiment of Satan. He allows it because he can still control the whole situation, and he lets those things, just like he let those giants terrorize the nation of Israel, he lets those scary things terrorize mankind now. Because some folks will give in to that kind of deception, and they are pretty much destined to not be saved, I reckon. But there's some people that'll get it, and there's some people that'll be scared enough to go, ooh, I better get right. So what conclusion have I come to? Well, giants, literal giants, existed in the world past. There's just way too much. Just staying in the King James Bible, there's way too much evidence with the little details and the little things, and it's scattered everywhere. There's way too much for it to be a contrived type of thing. It's very believable, very understandable. And if you got the Spirit in you and you really ask God for the kind of wisdom that you can in James chapter 1, He'll show you that there's some of these things that you never thought were real that really are. What else? Whatever conclusion have I come to? Well, Scripture doesn't say it stopped. I don't see anywhere that indicates that this type of wickedness with angels somehow lusting after women and coming down and having children by them and having giants come from all that, I don't see anything that tells us that that's stopped in the world up and even till now. So my mind says, how do you make that fit, Gary? That's got to fit in Scripture, and that's why I started hunting, because I got to, a lot of times this stuff is for me, right? What conclusion have I come to? What other conclusion? Well, I've come to the conclusion in my study that the whole Bigfoot and Sasquatch and Yeti and all them kind of things, that they fit the bill. Now, maybe not in a specific type of description, but we don't have a very specific description of giants. So maybe they do. But in a general sense of what we understand, if we look at the second law of thermodynamics, which is the law of entropy, that means that nothing improves, everything gets worse. So that gene pool, that stock that Satan's trying to work from, is getting worse and worse as time goes on. Man's not evolving, he's devolving. And then you take that and you add the validity of so much worldwide union in sightings and accounts through history. It's hard for you to not see how they kind of fit together. Are giants in the earth now? I think so. Just not very conspicuous. You know, this all matters. Every bit of this. I know this sounds crazy. It's like, why does a study about giants in the Bible matter? Well, as I stated before, it matters because we should turn to Scripture to answer all the questions that come up in life. All of them, even the weird ones. It matters to me in particular because I want to know. I want to settle it enough that I can explain it to someone else. That's part of me doing these studies is because I keep myself to a standard. I've got to understand it enough that I can articulate it in an intelligent and palatable way. So that keeps me constantly looking at my own studies and making sure and praying over things and making sure that I haven't missed something or I don't have something out of whack. But I want to settle it though. That's part of the reason why these things go, is so that in my mind, somebody comes to me, I want to be able to explain it to them. And I ain't talking about convince. I ain't talking about sway somebody. Just tell you what I've discovered. I hear skeptics all the time try to trip someone up who says they're a Christian. I'm sure you've probably heard it too. Bringing up weird stuff, trying to see if they, if they don't have an answer, then it's like, aha, right? Well, this study here is one that I hope I've helped better equip you to handle it if it ever comes up. Colossians 4 verse 6 says that you need to know how to answer every man. Well, what is that verse right there says? Know how to answer every man? Well, that means that man comes to you asking questions. You got to be able to handle somebody asking you questions. That's part of the reason why I hunt through this stuff. I go after it like I'm hunting for treasure, man, because I want to have a grasp on it. There's still going to be some things that remain unknown to some extent, right? How do the angels convince the women? Man, I don't know. How do they conceal that type of birth? Man, I don't know. What happens to the women? Did the presence of the giants increase the evil among man? Like it says there in 6, where the giants were there, and then God says man's heart was continually evil. Was there a connection there? I don't know. Will God use them giants. Will God use giants to terrorize man during the time of Jacob's trouble? I don't know. Maybe that's why he's leaving them remaining on this earth, so that he can use them there at the end. Just because we can't understand it all doesn't mean what we do understand isn't true. I hope this study helps equip you and help you to have a more clear understanding of our world, even the weird stuff. Okay? See you next time.